The metal coffin broke through the surface of the churning Atlantic like a messenger from hell itself. Calvin Harper's weathered hands trembled as he pried open the rusted lid, and what he saw inside made him collapse to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Inside wasn't a body, it was something far more devastating, the answer to a 160-year-old family mystery that would change everything. Friends, stay with me until the end of this incredible story, and please comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this tale has traveled. The September storm came without mercy. Calvin Harper had seen plenty of hurricanes in his 53 years on the Carolina coast, but this one felt different, personal. Like the Atlantic Ocean had finally decided to collect on some ancient debt. The wind howled through the gaps in his weathered shack's walls, a banshee's wail that spoke of ships long lost and sailors never returned home. "Just you and me tonight, old girl," Calvin muttered to the storm, taking another pull from his whiskey bottle. The amber liquid burned down his throat, a small fire against the cold that had settled into his bones years ago, ever since Sarah died, ever since the Navy told him his services were no longer required, ever since the world had moved on without him. His small fishing boat, the Second Chance, groaned against its moorings at the private dock behind his shack. Calvin watched through the salt-stained window as waves the size of houses rolled past their white caps, glowing like ghost lights in the darkness. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos for brief, terrifying moments. In those flashes, the ocean looked alive, angry, and hungry. Calvin had chosen this life deliberately. After 20 years in the Navy, after losing Sarah to cancer, after watching their dreams of children and grandchildren fade into medical bills and funeral arrangements, he'd retreated here to this forgotten stretch of Carolina coastline where the land was too marshy for development and the fishing was just good enough to keep a man alive, but not wealthy enough to draw competition. The locals in the town of Saltwater Bay, 15 miles south, called him Captain Coffin, not because of any morbid fascination, but because Calvin Harper might as well have been dead to the world. He came to town once a month for supplies, spoke to no one beyond the necessary pleasantries, and disappeared back to his hermit's existence before anyone could ask about his past or his pain. But tonight, as the storm raged, something stirred in Calvin that he hadn't felt in years. Call it intuition, call it his old Navy instincts, but something was coming. He could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the pattern of the waves, in the very electricity of the air. "Sarah always said I was too stubborn to die," he said to the empty room, to the photograph on the mantel that showed a younger version of himself in dress. Whites, a beautiful woman in a sundress laughing beside him. Guess we're about to test that theory. The storm intensified as the night wore on. By 3 a.m, Calvin had given up any pretense of sleep. He sat in his creaking rocking chair, the one Sarah had bought at a yard sale their first year of marriage, and listened to his house fight for its life. Shingles tore free from the roof like cards scattered by an angry gambler. Something heavy, probably the old crab trap he'd been meaning to secure, slammed against the exterior wall. Then came the sound that made him freeze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't debris. It was metal scraping against wood, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from the dock itself. Calvin grabbed his waterproof flashlight and headed for the door. The wind nearly tore it from its hinges when he opened it, rain driving horizontally into his face like needles. He fought his way down the narrow path to the dock, his boots slipping in the mud, one hand always maintaining contact with the guide rope he'd installed years ago for nights exactly like this. The dock was still there barely. Several planks had been torn away and the entire structure listed to one side. But that wasn't what caught Calvin's attention. There, tangled in the pilings and partially submerged in the churning water, was something that didn't belong. At first, Calvin thought it was part of a shipping container, the kind that occasionally fell off cargo ships during storms. But as his flashlight beam played across its surface, he realized it was too small, too carefully crafted. It was a coffin. A metal coffin. What in the name of... Calvin's words were swallowed by the wind. The thing was massive, easily 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, made of what looked like bronze or copper that had turned green with age and seawater. Barnacles clustered across its surface like a disease, and strands of seaweed draped over it like a grieving widow's veil. But beneath the oceanic growth, Calvin could make out engraving symbols and letters that seemed to dance in the unstable beam of his flashlight. The storm was getting worse. If Calvin didn't act now, the coffin would either be dragged back out to sea or would take his dock with it. Without really thinking about why, maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the 3 drinks he'd had, or maybe it was just the simple fact that he'd had nothing interesting happen to him in 5 years. Calvin made a decision. He fought his way to his storage shed, emerging with chains and his come-along winch. It took him nearly an hour, working in conditions that would have challenged him even in his Navy prime, but eventually he managed to secure the chains around the coffin. Inch by painful inch, he winched it up onto what remained of his dock, then further still dragging it up the muddy path toward higher ground. By the time he got it to the relative safety of the area beside his shack, Calvin was exhausted. His hands bled from where the chains had cut through his work gloves. His back screamed in protest. But the coffin was secure, resting now like a sleeping giant in his yard. Calvin stood over it, rain streaming down his face, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. Leave it for morning, he told himself. But even as he said it, he knew sleep would be impossible now. Inside, he toweled off and changed into dry clothes. But his eyes kept drifting to the window, to the dark shape outside that seemed to pulse with mysterious significance. He tried to distract himself, made coffee, attempted to read one of the paperback westerns he bought by the dozen at the thrift store, even turned on his ancient radio to listen to the storm coverage. Nothing worked. Finally, as dawn broke gray and violent through the still active storm clouds, Calvin gave up and went back outside. The coffin looked different in the daylight, more real somehow, more impossible. It was definitely older than anything that should have been floating in the Atlantic. The metalwork was intricate despite the damage. Calvin could make out what looked like roses entwined with anchors and letters that might have spelled words in English, though the barnacles and corrosion made it hard to be certain. "Where did you come from?" Calvin asked the coffin, running his hand along its surface. A barnacle cut his palm, and he jerked back, watching a drop of his blood fall onto the green metal. For a moment, just a moment, he could have sworn the coffin hummed in response. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan and a dozen combat situations, told him to call the authorities. This was clearly a matter for the Coast Guard, maybe even the police. But another part of him, a part he hadn't heard from in years, whispered that this was meant for him. That the storm hadn't brought this coffin to just anyone's dock, it had brought it to his. Calvin spent the rest of the morning clearing away the worst of the barnacles and seaweed with a putty knife and wire brush. It was tedious work, but it gave his hands something to do while his mind raced. As he worked, more details emerged. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. This wasn't some simple burial box. This was a work of art created by someone with skill and purpose. And then he found the nameplate. It was small, no bigger than a playing card, set into the metal near what would be the head of the coffin. Calvin had to scrape away decades of growth to reveal it, but when he did, his breath caught in his throat. Property of E. Harper, USS Magnolia Belle, 1864. Harper. Calvin's hand shook as he traced the letters. Harper was his name, his father's name, his grandfather's name, and his grandfather's grandfather's name, stretching back through generations of Carolina fishermen and sailors. Elijah, Calvin whispered. Elijah Harper. He knew that name. Every Harper knew that name. Elijah Harper was family legend, a story told at reunions and remembered at funerals. He'd been born free in 1825, one of the few free black men in North Carolina at the time. The story went that he joined the Union Navy during the Civil War, serving on a ship that had gone down with all hands somewhere off the Carolina coast. The family had never known exactly where or when, just that Elijah had never come home. But the Magnolia Belle Calvin frowned, trying to remember his naval history. That didn't sound like a Union ship name. Confederate ships often had names like that, romantic and Southern. But why would a free black man be serving on a Confederate vessel? Calvin's knees protested as he stood, joints popping like firecrackers. He needed information, needed to understand what he was looking at. But first he needed to open it. The coffin was sealed with what looked like bronze bolts, 8 on each side, their heads worn smooth by time and water. Calvin retrieved his toolkit from the shed, selecting a large adjustable wrench. The first bolt didn't budge. Neither did the second. It wasn't until Calvin applied penetrating oil and let it sit for an hour that he made any progress. The first bolt came free with a shriek of metal that sounded almost human. Calvin jumped back, heart racing. Just metal on metal, Dick, he told himself. Just physics and oxidation. But his hands trembled as he moved to the second bolt. It took him the entire day. By the time the sun was setting, the storm finally having moved on to terrorize points north, Calvin had removed all 16 bolts. The lid of the coffin sat loose but still sealed, waiting for him to make the final decision. Calvin went inside and poured himself another whiskey. Then another. Dutch courage, Sarah would have called it. She'd always been braver than him in the ways that mattered. She would have opened it hours ago. Would have faced whatever was inside with her chin up and her eyes clear. "What do you think, baby?" he asked her photograph. "Should I open Pandora's box?" Sarah smiled back at him, frozen in time, forever young, forever gone. Calvin set down his glass and walked back outside. The moon had risen full and bright now that the storm clouds had passed. It turned the world silver, and shadow made everything look like a dream or a memory. Calvin placed both hands on the lid of the coffin and took a deep breath. "Elijah Harper," he said to the night, "if this is you, I want you to know you're with family. You made it home." He lifted. The lid was heavier than he expected, and it took all his remaining strength to raise it. The hinges miraculously still worked, though they screamed like the damned as the lid swung open. Calvin grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the interior. There was no body. Instead, the coffin was filled with wooden chests, each about the size of a shoebox, packed in neat rows. They were wrapped in what looked like oilcloth preserved against the elements. Calvin counted quickly 12 chests, all identical, all bearing the same symbol burned into their tops, a rose entwined with an anchor. With shaking hands, Calvin lifted out the first chest. It was surprisingly heavy. The oilcloth fell away at his touch, revealing wood that looked almost new despite its age. There was a simple latch, no lock. Calvin flipped it open. Gold coins spilled out onto the ground, glinting in the moonlight like fallen stars. Calvin fell to his knees, his hands running through the coins in disbelief. They were real. He could feel their weight, their coldness. Some bore the image of Lady Liberty, others the Confederate seal. There must have been hundreds in just this one chest. "Dear God," Calvin breathed. He opened the second chest. This one contained jewelry, rings, necklaces, bracelets, all of obvious age and value. The third held papers wrapped in waxed cloth. Calvin carefully unwrapped them, finding Confederate bonds, property deeds, and what looked like military dispatches. But it was the fourth chest that made Calvin cry. Inside, cushioned in rotted velvet, was a locket. It was simple, made of silver rather than gold, and when Calvin opened it, he found two things: a tiny photograph of a woman and child, and an inscription. For Elijah Harper. "May you find freedom in this life or the next. Your loving wife." Rebecca. Calvin's tears fell freely, now dropping onto the silver locket like rain. This was proof, absolute proof that the family stories were true. Elijah Harper had existed. He'd had a wife, a child. He'd been loved. But what was he doing with Confederate gold? Calvin carefully examined the papers from the third chest. Most were too water-damaged to read, but one document better preserved than the others was partially legible. It appeared to be orders of some kind signed by someone whose name was obscured. But Calvin could make out enough cargo to be delivered to. Essential for the cause. Harper's knowledge of these waters. Trusted despite. Upon completion, freedom papers for... "Freedom papers," Calvin whispered. The pieces were falling into place. Elijah hadn't been serving the Confederacy by choice or belief. He'd been making a deal his knowledge of the Carolina coastline, probably gained from years of fishing these same waters, in exchange for freedom papers. Maybe not for himself, he was already free, but for others. Family members, perhaps. Friends still in bondage. But something had gone wrong. The ship had sunk, taking Elijah and the Confederate gold with it. Until now. Until the storm had somehow dislodged the coffin from wherever it had rested for over a century and a half, bringing it to the one person who would recognize the name, who would understand its significance. Calvin sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just treasure, though the monetary value was obviously enormous. This was history. This was vindication for every Harper who'd kept Elijah's story alive. This was dangerous. The thought hit Calvin like cold water. He had maybe $1 million in Civil War-era gold and jewelry sitting in his backyard. He lived alone, isolated, with no security beyond a rusty padlock on his shed. And storms, like the one that had just passed, always brought scavengers, people looking to profit from whatever washed ashore. Calvin quickly closed the chests and placed them back in the coffin, lowering the lid. He needed time to think to plan, but first he needed to hide this better. It took him until dawn, but Calvin managed to drag the coffin into his shed, covering it with a tarp and stacking his crab traps and fishing gear on top. It wasn't perfect, but it would do for now. Exhausted beyond measure, Calvin finally stumbled into his house and collapsed on his bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elijah Harper's face, not as it was, because he had no idea what his ancestor had looked like, but as he imagined it, proud, desperate, clever enough to try to use the Confederacy's gold against them, brave enough to risk everything for freedom. "You made it home," Calvin said to the ceiling. "Took you long enough, but you made it home." Outside, the Atlantic Ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore as if nothing had changed. But for Calvin Harper, everything had changed. The storm hadn't just brought him treasure. It had brought him purpose. It had brought him family. It had brought him a reason to rejoin the world. The coffin sat in his shed, patient, as it had been patient for 16 decades, waiting for Calvin to decide what to do next. But Calvin already knew deep in his bones that this discovery would not remain secret for long. The storm had brought Elijah Harper home, yes, but it had also set in motion events that Calvin couldn't yet foresee. In the distance, a truck rumbled down the coastal road, unusual for this time of morning. Calvin watched through his window as it slowed near his property, then continued on. Probably nothing. Probably just someone checking storm damage. But Calvin's Navy instincts, dormant for so long, were fully awake now. He reached into his closet and pulled out his father's old shotgun, checking that it was loaded. Then he made coffee, strong and black, and settled in to watch the road. The treasure was miraculous. The family connection was profound. But Calvin Harper hadn't survived Afghanistan by believing in coincidences. The storm had brought him Elijah's coffin for a reason, and Calvin suspected that reason was about to become very clear very soon. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, revealing a world washed clean by the storm. But Calvin knew better than to trust appearances. Under every clean surface was history, mystery, and sometimes danger. He thought about Sarah, what she would say if she could see him now. She'd probably laugh at the irony Calvin Harper, who'd run away from the world after her death, suddenly thrust into a situation that would demand he engage with it fully. She'd always said he was at his best when he had a mission, a purpose beyond himself. "Looks like you were right again, baby," he said to her photograph. "Even from beyond, you're still looking out for me." A car door slammed somewhere up the road. Calvin stood shotgun in hand and moved to the window. Two men were walking down the coastal road, supposedly examining storm damage. But their eyes kept drifting to Calvin's property, to his shed. Calvin smiled grimly. It was starting already. Word must have gotten out somehow. Maybe someone had seen him dragging the coffin up from the dock. Maybe the truck from earlier had spotted something. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that Calvin Harper, hermit fisherman, was about to become Calvin Harper, guardian of his family's legacy. He checked the shotgun again and opened his front door, stepping out onto the porch. The two men immediately changed direction, heading back to their car. But they'd be back. Others would come too. Calvin looked toward his shed where Elijah Harper's coffin waited with its burden of gold and history. He'd wanted to die alone, forgotten his pain and memories buried with him. But the storm and the sea had other plans. They'd brought him a reminder that he was part of something larger. A family story that stretched back through time, a legacy of courage and cleverness and survival against impossible odds. "All right, Elijah," Calvin said softly. "You made it this far. Let's see if I can get you the rest of the way home." The morning sun climbed higher, and Calvin Harper stood guard over his ancestors' treasure, knowing that everything in his life had led to this moment. The Navy training, the isolation, the pain of loss, it had all prepared him for this. He was ready for whatever came next. But first he needed more coffee. It was going to be a long day. The coffee had gone cold in Calvin's cup, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the road where dust still lingered from the departed car. Those men would be back, he was certain of it. The question was how many others they'd bring with them. Calvin moved through his small house with newfound purpose, pulling dusty boxes from closets he hadn't opened in years. Sarah's things were still there, carefully preserved like artifacts from a happier life. But beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, similar to what had protected the chests in Elijah's coffin, Calvin found what he was looking for. His service pistol cleaned and oiled before being stored away. 2 boxes of ammunition. And most importantly, the satellite phone he'd kept from his Navy days, its battery long dead, but the charging cable still intact. "Never thought I'd need you again," Calvin muttered, plugging the phone into the wall outlet. It would take hours to charge, but when it did, he'd have a secure line to the outside world. The question was who to call. The local sheriff was out of the question. Bob Thurman was a good enough man, but he had a mouth bigger than the Grand Canyon and a wife who treated gossip like currency. One word to Bob about Confederate gold and half the state would know by sundown. The Coast Guard made more sense, but Calvin knew how that would go. They'd confiscate everything tied up in maritime law for years, maybe decades. Elijah's story would be lost in bureaucracy, reduced to case numbers and evidence tags. His ancestor deserved better than that. Calvin was still pondering his options when he heard the sound of tires on gravel. Not from the road this time, but from his own driveway. He grabbed the shotgun and moved to the window, then relaxed slightly. It was Martha Chen who delivered mail to the isolated homes along the coast. Her ancient mail truck wheezed to a stop near his porch. "Calvin Harper, you still alive in there?" Martha called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been checking on stubborn hermits for 30 years. She was a small woman, Vietnamese-American, tough as ship's rope and twice as reliable. Calvin opened the door, trying to look normal despite his exhaustion. "Still kicking, Martha. Hell of a storm." Martha's sharp eyes took in everything: the mud on his clothes, the cuts on his hands, the shotgun leaning against the doorframe. "Looks like you had yourself an adventure. Found anything interesting washing up?" The question was casual, but Calvin caught something in her tone. Martha drove these roads every day, knew every person for 50 miles in either direction. If anyone had seen him last night, they would have told Martha. "Just the usual storm debris," Calvin said carefully. "Nothing worth mentioning." Martha studied him for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out his mail. Bills mostly, and a catalog for boat parts, but she held on to one envelope, tapping it against her palm. "Funny thing," she said. "This morning I had 3 different people ask me about you. Wanted to know if you lived alone, if you ever had visitors, that sort of thing. Now, why do you suppose folks are suddenly so interested in Calvin Harper?" Calvin kept his expression neutral. "Couldn't say. Maybe they're worried about storm damage." "Maybe." Martha handed him the last envelope. It was different from the others, older, the paper yellowed with age. "This came through the dead letter office. No return address, but it's addressed to any living descendant of Elijah Harper. Post office has been trying to deliver it for years, apparently. Finally tracked it down to you." She paused. "Interesting timing, wouldn't you say?" Calvin's hand trembled as he took the envelope. The address was written in fading ink, the handwriting formal and precise. Where did this come from? Charleston originally, from some historical society that went defunct in the 1970s. Martha was watching him carefully now. "Calvin, I've been delivering mail out here for a long time. I know when folks are in trouble, you need help." For a moment, Calvin wanted to tell her everything. Martha was trustworthy, had proven it 100 times over, but involving her would only put her at risk. "I'm fine, Martha. Just tired from fighting the storm." She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes. But she nodded anyway. "You've got my number if that changes. And Calvin, whatever you found out there, be careful. Storms bring out more than just driftwood. They bring out the worst in people, too." After she left, Calvin stood in his doorway, holding the mysterious letter, afraid to open it, afraid not to. Finally, he sat at his kitchen table and carefully slit the envelope with his pocket knife. Inside was a single sheet of paper, brittle with age, and a small brass key. The letter was dated 1963, written in the same formal hand as the address. To the descendant of Elijah Harper. "My name is Cornelius Ashford. and I am the last surviving member of the Charleston Historical Preservation Society. For decades, our society has guarded a secret one passed down from my grandfather who knew your ancestor personally. Elijah Harper was no traitor despite what certain histories might claim. He was a hero who infiltrated Confederate operations to gather intelligence for the Union. The gold he transported was meant to fund Confederate operations in Europe, but Elijah ensured it never reached its destination. He sacrificed his life to keep that blood money from prolonging the war. If you're reading this, it means the Harper line has survived, and it is time for the truth to be known. The key enclosed opens a deposit box at the Charleston Trust Bank Box, 1847. Inside, you will find documents that prove Elijah's true allegiance and his heroic actions. Guard this truth well. There are those even now who would prefer certain stories remain buried. Yours in historical truth. Cornelius Ashford. Calvin read the letter 3 times each reading, revealing new layers of meaning. Elijah hadn't been making a deal with the Confederates, he'd been playing them. A free black man pretending to help the Confederate cause while actually working to undermine it. The courage that must have taken the constant fear of discovery, the knowledge that one wrong word meant death. "You clever bastard," Calvin whispered, a smile breaking across his face. "You brilliant, brave, clever bastard." But the letter raised as many questions as it answered. If there were documents proving Elijah's true role, why hadn't they been released? Who were these people who wanted the story buried? And most importantly, how did the arrival of this letter coincide so perfectly with the coffin washing ashore? Calvin was reaching for the satellite phone, finally showing signs of life with a single battery bar when he heard vehicles approaching. Not 1 or 2 this time, but several. He moved to the window, and his heart sank. 3 pickup trucks were rolling down his driveway, packed with men. Calvin recognized some of them as local roughnecks, the kind who made their living on the edges of the law, salvaging smuggling, taking advantage of whatever opportunities came their way. Leading them was Jace Milner, and Calvin's stomach turned at the sight of him. Jace was what happened when mean combined with smart in all the wrong ways. He ran a salvage operation out of Beaufort technically. Legal, but everyone knew he dealt in goods that fell off trucks. Boats that went missing cargo that mysteriously disappeared from the docks. If Jace was here, it meant word about the coffin had spread further than Calvin had feared. Calvin grabbed the shotgun and stepped out onto his porch before they could reach his door. "That's close enough, Jace." Jace Milner stopped about 20 feet away, his hands spread in a gesture of false friendship. He was a big man, 6'3" and broad, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Now, Calvin, is that any way to greet neighbors? We're just checking on folks after the storm. Civic duty and all that." "Since when do you care about civic duty?" "Since I heard old Calvin Harper might have found something interesting last night." Jace's smile widened. Something that might be too much for one man to handle alone. Something that might need professional salvage expertise. The men behind Jace spread out slightly, not quite surrounding Calvin, but making their intent clear. Calvin counted 8 of them, all young, all hungry-looking in the way of men who'd grown up without enough and had decided to take what they wanted. "Nothing here but storm damage and broken dreams," Calvin said, keeping the shotgun casual but visible. "You're wasting your time." "Funny thing," Jace said, pulling out his phone and showing Calvin a photo. It was grainy, taken at night, but clear enough to show Calvin dragging something large up from his dock. "My cousin Billy was out last night checking his crab traps after the storm. Saw you hauling something mighty interesting, something that looked an awful lot like a coffin." Calvin said nothing. Denial would be pointless now. "Now, here's how I see it." Jace continued, his reasonable tone more menacing than any threat. "Maritime salvage law is complicated. Who owns what? Who found it first? All sorts of legal tangles. Could tie things up in court for years. Or we could come to an arrangement, a partnership. You found it. We help you process it. 60-40 split. That's more than fair. 40% for me finding it? Oh no, Calvin. 60 for you. I'm not a greedy man." The lie slid off Jace's tongue like oil. "But without my help, you might find it hard to keep whatever you found. Lots of dangerous people out there, you know. Storms bring out the worst in folks." It was the second time today Calvin had heard that phrase, but coming from Jace, it sounded like a promise rather than a warning. "I need time to think about it," Calvin said. Sure. Take your time. We'll just have a look around while you're thinking." Jace started walking toward the shed. Calvin raised the shotgun. "I said that's close enough." The atmosphere changed instantly. Hands moved toward concealed weapons. The pretense of friendliness evaporated like morning mist. "Calvin," Jace said softly, "you're outnumbered 8-1. You're an old man living alone with no backup coming. Do you really want to do this?" "I'm not that old," Calvin replied, his voice steady despite the odds. "And I've got 2 barrels and a box of shells. I might not get all of you, but I'll get the first 2 who move. And Jace, you'll be one of them. Now ask yourself, is whatever you think I found worth dying for?" For a moment, nobody moved. Calvin could feel his heart pounding, could taste copper in his mouth, but his hands were steady. 20 years of Navy training didn't just disappear. The muscle memory was still there, waiting. One of the younger men, barely out of his teens, started to reach for something in his jacket. Calvin swung the shotgun toward him, and the boy froze. "Danny, don't," Jace said sharply. Then to Calvin, "You can't stay awake forever, old man, and that shotgun won't stop us from coming back." "Maybe not, but it'll stop you today." Jace stared at Calvin for a long moment, calculating. Then he smiled again, that cold, meaningless expression. "Boys, let's go. Mr. Harper needs his rest." They retreated to their trucks, but Calvin knew this was far from over. As the vehicles turned around, Jace called out through his window, 48 hours, Calvin. After that, my offer changes, and you won't like the new terms." Calvin waited until the dust settled before going back inside. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline aftermath making him feel every one of his 53 years. He needed help, and he needed it fast. The satellite phone finally had a decent charge. Calvin scrolled through the stored numbers, most of them years out of date. But one name stopped him, Hank Wallace. They'd served together in Afghanistan, and Hank had retired to run a security company in Colombia. If anyone could help protect Elijah's treasure, it would be Hank. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "This better not be a telemarketer, or I swear to God." "Hank, it's Calvin Harper." There was a pause. "Calvin. Jesus Christ, I thought you were dead. Haven't heard from you since Sarah's funeral. I need help, Hank, bad. Where are you?" "Still at the Coast House. Listen, I can't explain everything over the phone, but I found something big, and there are already people trying to take it." "How many people?" 8 so far, but there'll be more. I can be there in 3 hours. Can you hold out that long?" Calvin looked out at his shed where Elijah's coffin waited with its burden of gold and history. "I'll have to." "Calvin, how big is big?" "Civil War gold, Hank. Maybe $1 million worth. But that's not the important part. It's connected to my family, to history that needs to be preserved." "Shit. Okay, I'm bringing backup. Real backup, not the mall cops I usually employ. And Calvin, if someone comes before I get there, don't be a hero. Gold isn't worth dying for." "This is." After hanging up, Calvin set about preparing for a siege. He moved furniture to block windows, filled buckets with water in case someone tried to burn him out, and loaded every weapon he could find. His father's old rifle from the closet, the pistol from his Navy days, even an ancient flare gun from his boat. As he worked, Calvin thought about Elijah Harper alone on a Confederate ship, surrounded by enemies carrying gold that could extend a war he was secretly fighting against. The courage that must have taken, the loneliness, the fear that one wrong word, one suspicious look would mean discovery and death. "I've got it easier than you did," Calvin said to the empty room. "At least my enemies aren't pretending to be friends." The afternoon sun was brutal, making the humid air shimmer like water. Calvin positioned himself where he could see both the driveway and the shed, the shotgun across his lap, the pistol within easy reach. Every car that passed on the main road made him tense. Every bird call could be someone signaling. Around 3 o'clock, Calvin saw movement in the trees beyond his property. Someone was watching him, had probably been there for hours. He pretended not to notice, but quietly checked his weapons again. They were testing him, seeing if he had help, if he was really alone. The brass key from Cornelius Ashford's letter sat on the table beside him, catching the light. Box 1847 at the Charleston Trust Bank. documents that would prove Elijah's heroism. But first, Calvin had to survive the next few hours. His phone rang the landline this time. Calvin debated not answering, then picked it up on the fifth ring. "Mr. Harper." The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "My name is Dr. Patricia Thornton. I'm a historian at the University of South Carolina. I believe you may have found something of significant historical importance." "Lady, this is not a good time. I understand you're in danger. That's why I'm calling. The artifacts you've discovered, they're more important than you know. There are people who have been searching for that Confederate gold for over a century, not for its monetary value, but for what it represents." "What are you talking about?" "Mr. Harper, that gold was payment for something specific. Weapons. Weapons that were supposed to be delivered to Confederate guerrillas who planned to continue fighting even after the war ended. Your ancestor stopped that from happening. He saved countless lives. But there are people today, descendants of those guerrillas, who see that gold as their rightful inheritance. They call themselves the Sons of the Gray Dawn." Calvin felt a chill despite the heat. "Are you telling me I'm dealing with some kind of Confederate cult?" "I'm telling you that Jace Milner's interest in your find isn't just about money. His great-great-grandfather was one of the men waiting for those weapons. This is about what they see as historical justice." "How do you know about Jace? How do you know about any of this?" "Because I've been researching your ancestor for 15 years. I knew that Coffin was out there somewhere. The storm. I've been monitoring weather patterns, knowing that something like this might dislodge it from wherever it had been resting. When I heard about suspicious activity in your area, you're watching me too. Mr. Harper, I'm trying to help you. That gold, those documents you found, they need to be properly preserved and studied. They could rewrite a chapter of American history, but only if we can keep them safe from people who would rather see them destroyed or hidden away again." Calvin was about to respond when he saw more vehicles approaching. Not from the driveway this time, but from the old beach access road that ran behind his property. They were trying to surround him. "I have to go," Calvin said, hanging up. He counted 4 vehicles, this time more men piling out. But these weren't Jace's local thugs. These men moved with purpose, with training. Calvin recognized the way they used cover-the-hand signals they employed. Military or ex-military. The phone rang again. Calvin ignored it, focusing on the approaching threat. They were staying out of shotgun range, setting up positions. Waiting for something. Then Calvin heard it, the sound he'd been both dreading and hoping for. Helicopters. But whose the first one came in low over the trees, a civilian model, but moving with military precision. It circled once, then hovered over Calvin's property. A rope dropped, and men began fast roping down. Calvin raised his shotgun, then lowered it as he recognized the lead figure. Hank Wallace looked exactly the same as he had 5 years ago, built like a linebacker with a face that could stop a clock. He was carrying an assault rifle and wearing body armor, his team spreading out behind him with practiced efficiency. "Cavalry's here, Calvin," Hank shouted over the helicopter noise. "Now where are these assholes who want to steal from my brother?" The men who'd been approaching from the beach road had stopped, uncertain now that the odds had changed. Calvin could see them talking on radios, probably calling Jace for instructions. "They're going to wait us out," Calvin told Hank as they took cover behind Calvin's truck. "Jace gave me 48 hours to think about his offer." Jace Milner. "That piece of shit is still around," Hank spat. "He tried to sell stolen military equipment a few years back. We've got history." "This is about more than just gold, Hank." Calvin quickly explained what Dr. Thornton had told him about the Sons of the Gray Dawn. Hank's expression darkened. "Neo-Confederate assholes. I've run into their type before. They're more dangerous than regular thieves because they think God's on their side." He looked at the shed. "The stuff's in there." Calvin nodded. "A whole coffin full of gold and documents. It belonged to my ancestor, Elijah Harper. He died keeping it from the Confederates." "Then we're sure as hell not letting their fan club get it now." Hank pulled out his phone. "I'm calling in more favors. We need this place locked down tight until we can get the proper authorities here. Real authorities, not local boys who might be sympathetic to Jace's cause." As Hank made his calls, Calvin noticed something troubling. The men who'd been watching from the tree line were gone. So were the vehicles from the beach road. They'd pulled back completely. "That's not good," Hank said, following Calvin's gaze. When the enemy retreats without a fight, it means they're planning something. Night was falling, and Calvin could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at him. He'd been awake for over 36 hours running on adrenaline and coffee, but he couldn't rest, not yet. "We need to move the coffin," Calvin said. "They know it's in the shed. That makes us a stationary target." "Where would we take it?" Before Calvin could answer, his satellite phone rang. It was Dr. Thornton again. "Mr. Harper, you need to listen very carefully. I've been monitoring local communications. Jace Milner has called in reinforcements from 3 states. They're planning to come at you tonight, probably around 3 a.m. when they think you'll be exhausted. But that's not the worst part." "What could be worse?" "Someone leaked this to the media. By tomorrow morning, every treasure hunter and news crew in the Southeast will be heading your way. You need to move those artifacts now tonight, or you'll lose control of this situation completely." Calvin looked at Hank, who'd been listening. "Can your helicopter carry a 7-foot coffin?" "Not that one. But I know someone with a cargo chopper. Give me 20 minutes. As Hank made more calls, Calvin walked to the shed. His simple life, his self-imposed exile from the world was over. Elijah Harper's arrival had changed everything. But maybe that was as it should be. Elijah had sacrificed his life to keep that gold from funding more violence. The least Calvin could do was see his mission completed. Inside the shed, Calvin pulled back the tarp and looked at the coffin. In the dying light, it seemed to glow with its own importance. "We're getting you out of here," Calvin promised. "You've waited long enough." A shot rang out, shattering the shed window. Calvin dove for cover as more bullets punched through the wooden walls. They weren't waiting for 3 a.m. after all. "Calvin, you okay?" Hank shouted from outside. "Yeah, but they're not playing around anymore." Calvin could hear vehicles roaring up his driveway, could hear men shouting orders. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was an assault. He grabbed the satellite phone and dialed Dr. Thornton. "Where can we take it? Where will it be safe?" "The University of South Carolina has a secure facility. I can have a team ready to receive it, but you have to get here." "We're working on that." More gunfire erupted, Hank's team returning fire. Calvin could hear the distinctive crack of assault rifles, the boom of shotguns. His quiet piece of coastline had become a battlefield. Then through the chaos, Calvin heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of glass breaking, not from bullets, but from something being thrown. Then the smell hit him. Gasoline. "They're going to burn us out," Calvin shouted. He looked at the coffin at Elijah Harper's final resting place. After surviving over a century on the ocean floor, after being brought home by a miracle of wind and wave, it was going to end in flames started by men who thought the Confederacy should have won. "Not today," Calvin growled. He burst out of the shed, shotgun blazing. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he kept firing, kept moving. He saw Jace Milner near the trucks directing his men like a general. Their eyes met across the chaos. "It's not yours," Calvin shouted. "It was never yours." Jace smiled that cold smile and pointed. One of his men raised what looked like a flare gun. Calvin dove as the flare sailed over his head, striking the shed. The old wood, soaked with gasoline, erupted in flames. "No!" Calvin tried to run toward the burning building, but Hank tackled him. "You can't! It's gone!" Calvin. But even as the flames rose higher, Calvin heard something that didn't make sense. A sound like metal groaning. The heat from the fire was causing the coffin to expand its sealed edges, beginning to separate. And then, impossibly, the shed door burst open from the inside. Through the inferno stepped a figure that made everyone freeze. It was one of Hank's men, Thompson, his clothes smoking but his arms wrapped around one of the wooden chests from the coffin. Behind him, barely visible through the smoke, 2 more of Hank's team were dragging the coffin itself using chains they'd found in Calvin's shed. "Move! Move! Move!" Hank shouted, providing covering fire as his men hauled their precious cargo away from the burning structure. The shed collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks and burning timber, but they'd saved it. They'd saved Elijah Harper's legacy from the flames. Jace Milner's face contorted with rage. "Take them down! All of them!" The firefight intensified, muzzle flashes, lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Calvin found himself pressed against his truck, reloading his shotgun with trembling fingers while bullets sparked off the metal above his head. This wasn't how he'd imagined his evening going when he'd woken up to check on storm damage. "Calvin, we need to move that coffin now," Hank shouted over the gunfire. "My guy with the cargo chopper is 10 minutes out, but we need to get to the extraction point." "What extraction point?" "The old Baptist church on Highway 17. It's got a field big enough for him to land." That was 3 miles away. 3 miles through roads that Jace's men had probably already blocked. Calvin's mind raced through possibilities, then landed on one that made him smile grimly. "We don't take the road," Calvin said. "We take the water." Hank looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What?" "My boat. The Second Chance. She's built for hauling reinforced hull for bringing in heavy nets. We load the coffin on her, take the inland waterway. It connects to Sassafras Creek, which runs right behind that church." "Can she carry that much weight?" "She's carried more, trust me." Hank made a decision. Thompson Rodriguez helped Harper get that coffin to his boat. Everyone else were laying down, suppressing fire. Make these bastards think twice about following. What followed was organized chaos. Under the covering fire of Hank's team, Calvin and 3 others managed to drag the coffin down the muddy path to his dock. The Second Chance bobbed in the water, miraculously undamaged by the storm. Calvin had built her sturdy, and she'd proven it. Loading the coffin was back-breaking work. It took all 4 of them using boards as ramps, and every curse word Calvin knew, but they managed to get it onto the deck. The boat sat lower in the water, but held steady. "The chests," Calvin remembered. "We can't leave the chests. On it." Rodriguez ran back up the path while Thompson started securing the coffin with dock lines. Calvin fired up the engine, his hands moving automatically through the startup sequence he'd performed thousands of times. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. He'd never been happier to hear that sound. Rodriguez came sliding down the path, his arms full of wooden chests, 2 more of Hank's men behind him carrying the rest. They threw them aboard just as the first of Jace's men appeared at the top of the path. "Go, go, go!" Hank shouted, laying down covering fire. Calvin threw the throttle forward, and the Second Chance lurched away from the dock. Bullets whined overhead and splashed into the water around them, but the darkness and distance were on their side now. Within minutes, they were out of effective rifle range, though Calvin could still hear the gunfight raging at his property. "Hank, get your men out of there," Calvin said into his satellite phone. "Already pulling back." Hank's voice crackled back. "We'll meet you at the church." "And Calvin, you better believe Jace is going to figure out where you're headed. We bought you time, not victory." Calvin knew Hank was right. The inland waterway was narrow in places with plenty of spots where someone could set up an ambush. But he knew these waters better than anyone had fished them since he was a boy, with his father learning every sandbar, every current, every shortcut. Rodriguez and Thompson crouched on the deck, their rifles ready, while Calvin navigated by instinct more than sight. The moon was hidden behind clouds, turning the water into black glass that reflected nothing. "Who are you people?" Calvin asked Thompson. "I mean, Hank said he was bringing backup, but you're not regular security guards." Thompson, a lean man with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much, smiled slightly. "Let's just say we're guys who owe Hank our lives. When he calls, we answer. Special Forces." "Something like that. Rodriguez there was Navy SEAL Team 6. Morrison back at your place was Delta. We're all retired technically, but some skills you don't forget." Calvin felt a surge of gratitude toward Hank. His old friend had brought serious firepower to this fight. They were passing through a narrow section bordered by marsh grass when Calvin heard engines ahead. He cut his own motor immediately, letting momentum carry them forward while he listened. 2 boats, maybe 3, moving slowly. Searching. "They're blocking the waterway," Rodriguez whispered. Calvin's mind raced. There was another route, but it meant navigating Hellhole Swamp, a maze of channels that changed with every storm. Most people who went in there without a guide never came out, but Calvin wasn't most people. "Hold on," he warned, then steered hard to starboard into a channel barely wider than his boat. The marsh grass rose around them like walls, muffling sound and blocking sight. Calvin navigated by memory and instinct, using a pole to push off when the channel became too narrow for the motor. Behind them he could hear confused shouts as Jace's boats tried to figure out where they'd gone. "They're not following," Thompson observed. "They'd be stupid to. One wrong turn in here and you're lost until daylight if you're lucky." Calvin pushed them around another bend. My daddy taught me these channels when I was 8, said every Harper should know the secret ways just in case. In case of what? He never said, but I'm thinking maybe he knew something like this might happen someday. They pulled through the swamp for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. Calvin's shoulders burned from the effort, but he didn't dare use the motor. The sound would echo through the channels, giving away their position. Finally, they emerged into Sassafras Creek. The church steeple was visible in the distance, lit by a single floodlight. Calvin started the engine again and pushed toward their destination. Movement on the shore. Rodriguez warned his rifle coming up. Calvin saw them too. Figures running along the bank trying to keep pace with the boat. But they were too far away to be accurate with small arms, and the second chance was moving fast now, her engine roaring defiance at their pursuers. The field behind the church came into view, and Calvin could see the cargo helicopter waiting, its rotors already turning. Hank's team had set up a perimeter, their weapons trained outward. Calvin beached the second chance with enough force to embed her bow in the muddy bank. There was no time for delicacy. Everyone out. Grab what you can. The next few minutes were a blur of motion. The coffin was their priority, requiring 6 men and every ounce of strength they had left to transfer it from boat to helicopter. The wooden chests went next, tossed aboard like sacks of potatoes, despite their precious contents. "Incoming!" someone shouted. Trucks were roaring across the field, headlights blazing. Jace had figured out their destination after all. "Everyone on the bird now," Hank commanded. Calvin hesitated, looking back at the second chance. She'd saved them, carried them to safety like she'd carried him through 5 years of self-imposed exile. Leaving her felt like betraying an old friend. "Calvin, move your ass!" Hank grabbed him and practically threw him into the helicopter. They lifted off just as Jace's trucks reached the landing zone. Calvin watched through the window as men poured out, firing up at the helicopter. A few rounds pinged off the armored undercarriage, but they were climbing fast out of range. Below, Calvin could see Jace Milner standing in the field, his face turned up toward them. Even from this height, Calvin could feel the man's rage. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Where to?" the pilot asked. "Columbia," Hank answered. "University of South Carolina. They're expecting us." Calvin slumped in his seat, exhaustion hitting him like a physical force. Around him, Hank's men were checking weapons, treating minor wounds, acting like this was just another day at the office. The coffin sat secured in the center of the cargo area, still dripping swamp water, still keeping its secrets. "You did good, Calvin," Hank said, sitting down beside him. "Your ancestor would be proud." Calvin thought about that. Would Elijah Harper be proud? Or would he wonder why it had taken over a century and a half for his story to finally come to light? Calvin ran his hand along the coffin's surface, feeling the engravings beneath his fingers. "Thompson," Calvin called out, "you saved this thing. Why?" "You don't even know me." Thompson looked uncomfortable with the attention. "My great-great-grandfather was in the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first black regiments in the Union Army. He fought because he believed in something bigger than himself. When Hank told me what this was about, what your ancestor did, I couldn't let it burn. Our history, the real history, it matters." The helicopter banked, and through the window, Calvin could see the lights of Columbia approaching. Somewhere down there, Dr. Patricia Thornton was waiting with her team of historians and preservationists. The gold would be cataloged, the documents studied, Elijah Harper's story finally told properly. But Calvin's mind kept going back to Jace Milner's face, to the promise of vengeance in his eyes. The Sons of the Gray Dawn wouldn't give up easily. They'd been nursing their grievances for over a century. They wouldn't let one fisherman and some retired Special Forces operators stop them. "Hank," Calvin said quietly, "what happens after we deliver this? Jace isn't going to just walk away." "No, he's not. But once this is in the university's hands, with proper documentation and media attention, it becomes a lot harder for him to make it disappear. Sunshine is the best disinfectant, brother." The helicopter began its descent toward a lit landing pad on the university campus. Calvin could see people waiting, a small crowd of academics and security personnel. As they touched down, a woman separated from the group and approached. Even in the harsh lighting from the helicopter's spots, Calvin could see she was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 40, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Harper, I'm Patricia Thornton. We spoke on the phone." Calvin shook her offered hand. "Dr. Thornton, this is Hank Wallace and his team. They're the only reason we made it here." "We owe you all a debt," Dr. Thornton said. "What you've protected isn't just treasure, it's truth. And truth has been in short supply when it comes to this period of history. The unloading process was more organized this time, with university staff using proper equipment to move the coffin into a waiting truck. Calvin noticed the heavy security presence uniformed officers, and some people in suits who had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. "FBI," Calvin asked Dr. Thornton. "Among others. Once I explained what we were dealing with, several agencies became very interested. The Sons of the Gray Dawn have been on watch lists for years. They've just been careful never to do anything actionable. Until tonight. So Jace is finished." Dr. Thornton's expression was carefully neutral. "Let's say Mr. Milner is about to have some very uncomfortable conversations with federal authorities about tonight's events. Armed assault, attempted theft of historical artifacts, conspiracy charges. He won't be bothering you again." They followed the truck into a loading dock that led to the university's Special Collections building. The security was impressive metal detectors, armed guards, cameras everywhere. Calvin felt some of the tension in his shoulders finally ease. Elijah's coffin was safe. Was in a climate-controlled room that looked more like an operating theater than a storage area. Calvin watched as white-gloved technicians carefully opened the coffin again. This time each chest was photographed, cataloged, and sealed in a protective container. The gold coins were spread out on tables, each one documented. "Mr. Harper," one of the technicians called out, "you should see this." At the bottom of the coffin, beneath where the chests had been, was another compartment Calvin hadn't noticed before. Inside was a leather journal, somehow preserved despite the years and water. Dr. Thornton carefully opened it, revealing pages of handwritten text. "It's Elijah's," she breathed. "His personal journal." Calvin moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The handwriting was careful, educated, each letter formed with precision. March 15, 1864. "They trust me because they must. I know these waters as they do not. They see my skin and think me grateful for any position, any coin. They do not see that I am counting their gold not for them, but against them. Each piece represents a bullet that will not be fired a day. The war will not be prolonged. Sarah's letters give me strength. She says little Calvin has begun to walk. I pray I will see him do so with my own eyes, but if not, I pray he will walk in a freer world because of what I do here." Calvin's throat tightened. Little Calvin, his own great-great-grandfather, Elijah's son. Dr. Thornton continued reading aloud. March 20th, 1864. "Captain Beauregard suspects nothing. He speaks freely in my presence, believing me too ignorant to understand. They plan to use this gold to buy British rifles ammunition enough to arm resistance fighters for years after the war's official end. They speak of a gray dawn when the South will rise again stronger and more terrible. I will not let this dawn come. Tomorrow, when we pass Devil's Shoal, I will do what must be done. The powder charges are set. May God forgive me for the lives that will be lost, but may he judge me by the lives that will be saved." "He sank his own ship," Calvin said in wonder. "He deliberately sank it to keep those weapons from being delivered." "A hero," Dr. Thornton said softly. "An unsung hero who sacrificed everything to shorten the war and prevent further bloodshed." They spent hours going through the journal, each entry revealing more of Elijah Harper's character, intelligence, and courage. He'd been recruited by the Union Navy, trained in secret, and sent back south to infiltrate Confederate operations. His knowledge of the coastal waters had made him invaluable to blockade runners, but he'd used that position to feed information to the Union and ultimately to stop a shipment that could have prolonged the conflict for years. "This changes everything," Dr. Thornton said. "Every textbook that mentions this period will need to be updated. Elijah Harper's name will be remembered alongside the greatest heroes of the Civil War." Calvin felt tears running down his face. He didn't try to stop them. After years of feeling disconnected from everything, of hiding from the world and his own pain, he'd been given this gift. Not just the gold, though the finder's fee would certainly change his circumstances, but the knowledge that he came from something noble, something brave. "Mr. Harper," an FBI agent approached. "We've arrested Jason Milner and 12 of his associates. The weapons charges alone will put them away for years, but we're also pursuing domestic terrorism charges related to their Sons of the Grey Dawn activities. Your testimony will be crucial." Calvin nodded. "Whatever you need." Hank clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it, brother. You protected your family's legacy." But even as Calvin accepted congratulations from the assembled team, his mind went to another document, the brass key still in his pocket. Box 1847 at the Charleston Trust Bank. Whatever was in there had waited over 60 years. It could wait a few more days. The sun was rising by the time they finished the initial cataloging. Calvin stood outside the university building, breathing in the morning air. It smelled different here, away from the salt and fish of the coast. It smelled like civilization, like possibility. "What will you do now?" Dr. Thornton asked, joining him. Calvin thought about it. His shack was probably destroyed either by Jace's men or by the fire. The second chance was abandoned in a creek miles from home. Everything he'd built in his isolation was gone. "I don't know," he admitted. "For 5 years I've been hiding, running from grief, from life." Then Elijah's coffin washed up, and suddenly I had a purpose again. Now that purpose is fulfilled, and I'm not sure what comes next. "If I might make a suggestion," Dr. Thornton said, "we're going to need someone to oversee the Harper collection. Someone who understands not just the historical significance, but the personal meaning. The university would be honored to have you involved." Calvin looked at her in surprise. "I'm not an academic, I'm just a fisherman." "You're a Harper. This is your family's story. Who better to help tell it?" Before Calvin could respond, his satellite phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello, Mr. Harper." The voice was elderly female with a slight tremor. "My name is Adelaide Harper Simmons. I'm your cousin, though we've never met. I saw the news this morning about what you found." Calvin's breath caught. He had family. Living family. "I'm 93 years old," Adelaide continued, "and I've been keeping the Harper family records for 70 years. There are more of us than you might think scattered across the country. We've all heard the stories of Elijah, but most thought they were just stories. Mr. Harper, what you've done proving Elijah was real was a hero. You've given us all back our history." "I'd like to meet you at," Calvin said, his voice thick with emotion. "There's going to be a gathering," Adelaide said. "All the Harpers who can make it. We want to be there when Elijah is properly honored. Will you come?" "Yes. Yes, absolutely." After the call ended, Calvin stood in the morning light feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Connection, purpose, hope. "You know," Hank said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "Sarah would be proud of you." Calvin accepted the coffee gratefully. "You think—" "I know. She always said you were at your best when you were fighting for something that mattered. And brother, this matters." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the campus wake up. Students were beginning to appear, heading to early classes completely unaware that history had been rewritten in the building behind them. "Hank, I need to ask you something. Your men, what you did for me." "I can't pay what that's worth," Hank laughed. "Calvin, you still don't get it, do you? This wasn't a job. This was brotherhood. You called, I answered. That's how it works. Besides, Thompson was right. This was about more than gold or even family. This was about making sure the true story gets told." A news van pulled up, then another. Word was spreading fast. Calvin realized his quiet life was truly over. Within hours, maybe less, Elijah Harper's story would be national news. "Ready for your close-up?" Dr. Thornton asked, approaching with a media relations person. Calvin thought about running about, retreating back to whatever remained of his coastal sanctuary. But then he thought about Elijah alone on a Confederate ship surrounded by enemies, still doing what was right despite the danger. "Yeah," Calvin said, straightening his shoulders. "I'm ready." As the cameras rolled and Calvin began to tell the story of Elijah Harper and the storm that brought him home, he felt something shift inside himself. The grief for Sarah was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him. He had a new mission now to ensure Elijah's sacrifice was remembered. that the Harper family story was told, that the truth prevailed over the myths and lies that had clouded history for too long. The treasure had been saved, but more importantly, a hero had been restored to his rightful place. And Calvin Harper, who'd wanted nothing more than to disappear from the world, found himself standing in front of it speaking for an ancestor who'd been silenced for over a century. "My name is Calvin Harper," he said to the cameras, "and I want to tell you about the bravest man you've never heard of." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows, illuminating truth that had been hidden in darkness for far too long. And somewhere Calvin thought Elijah Harper was finally at peace, his mission complete, his story told, his sacrifice honored. But even as Calvin spoke to the media, part of his mind was already planning the next step. The key in his pocket seemed to pulse with possibility. Box 1847 at the Charleston Trust Bank. Whatever secrets it held, Calvin would uncover them. He owed Elijah that much. The crowd of reporters grew larger, their questions coming fast and sharp, but Calvin answered them all with a calm he hadn't felt in years. He was a Harper. He came from a line of people who faced impossible odds and prevailed. The storm had reminded him of that, had literally washed his heritage up at his feet. "Mr. Harper," one reporter called out, "what do you think this discovery means for how we understand the Civil War?" Calvin considered the question carefully. "I think it means we need to look closer at the stories we think we know. How many other Elijah Harpers were there? How many heroes whose names were erased because they didn't fit the narrative someone wanted to tell? This discovery isn't an ending, it's a beginning. It's a call to uncover the truth, all of it, no matter how long it's been buried." As he spoke, Calvin felt the weight of generations of Harpers standing with him. Fishermen and sailors, men and women who'd worked the coastal waters, raised families, kept stories alive, even when the world told them those stories didn't matter. They mattered. They had always mattered. And now, finally, the world would know it too. The questions from reporters continued for another hour, before Dr. Thornton finally intervened, ushering Calvin away from the cameras with practiced efficiency. "You need rest," she said firmly. "The media will still be here tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. This story isn't going anywhere." Calvin allowed himself to be led to a quiet office in the university building where Hank was waiting with his men. Thompson had a bandage on his arm where Calvin hadn't noticed he'd been grazed by a bullet, and Rodriguez was cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of a professional. "The feds want to debrief you," Hank said. "But I told them it could wait until you've had some sleep and a decent meal. There's a hotel room waiting for you 2 blocks from here." Calvin shook his head. "I can't sleep, not yet. There's something else I need to do." He pulled the brass key from his pocket, holding it up to the light. "Charleston Trust Bank, box 1847. Whatever Cornelius Ashford left there has been waiting since 1963. "Calvin, you're dead on your feet," Hank protested. "I've come this far. I need to see this through." Calvin looked at his friend. "Elijah's journal talks about documents he prepared testimony about Confederate plans that went deeper than just the gold. What if those documents are in that box? What if there's more to uncover?" Dr. Thornton leaned forward, her academic excitement overcoming her concern. "The Charleston Trust Bank. That's only an hour-and-a-half drive. I could arrange for security, have someone from the university's legal department meet us there." "Us?" Calvin asked. "Mr. Harper, you've just handed me the historical discovery of a lifetime. If you think I'm letting you open that box without me, you're mistaken." Despite his exhaustion, Calvin smiled. "All right then. But we go now before Jace's lawyers get him out and he has time to regroup. The Sons of the Grey Dawn might be wounded, but they're not dead. If they know about this key, they might try to get there first," Hank finished. "Okay, we do this, but my way. Thompson, Rodriguez, you're with us. Morrison, coordinate with the feds, make sure they know where we're going and why." Within minutes, they were in 2 SUVs heading south toward Charleston. Calvin rode with Dr. Thornton and Hank, the morning highway traffic flowing around them like water around stones. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized, haggard and worn, but with a light in his eyes that had been absent for years. "Tell me about Cornelius Ashford," Calvin said to Dr. Thornton. The letter said his grandfather knew Elijah personally. Dr. Thornton pulled out her tablet, fingers flying across the screen. Cornelius Ashford, born 1891, died 1965, just 2 years after writing that letter to you. His grandfather was Marcus Ashford, a Union sympathizer who operated an underground railroad station in Charleston. According to historical records, Marcus helped dozens of enslaved people escape to freedom. And he knew Elijah. It makes sense. If Elijah was working undercover for the Union, he would have needed contacts, people who could pass information along. Marcus Ashford would have been perfectly positioned for that role. The drive took them through small Carolina towns that seemed frozen in time, past churches and graveyards where history lay buried beneath moss-covered stones. Calvin found himself wondering how many of those graves held stories like Elijah's tales of courage that had been deliberately forgotten or suppressed. There, Hank said, pointing to an ornate building on Charleston's historic King Street. Charleston Trust Bank, established 1823. The bank was a testament to old Southern architecture, all white columns and black shutters, looking more like a plantation house than a financial institution. Calvin felt a chill as they walked through the massive oak doors. This place had been standing when Elijah was alive, had probably held the accounts of the very people Elijah had been working against. The bank manager, a thin man named Prescott, with nervous hands and a perpetual frown, was clearly uncomfortable with their presence. Box 1847, you say, that's one of our heritage boxes, been paid up in perpetuity since before I was born. You have the key. Calvin showed him the brass key, and Prescott's eyes widened slightly. Yes, that's definitely one of ours. The old style. We haven't made keys like that since the 1920s. If you'll follow me. He led them down marble stairs to a vault that belonged in a museum. The walls were lined with brass-fronted boxes, some dating back to the bank's founding. Box 1847 was larger than most, requiring Prescott to use a wheeled ladder to reach it. This box, Prescott said, consulting a leather-bound ledger, was originally opened in 1878 by Marcus Ashford. It's been in continuous use by the Ashford Family Trust since then. The last access was 1963 by Cornelius Ashford. Calvin inserted the key with hands that barely trembled. The lock turned smoothly despite its age, and the box door swung open. Inside was a leather portfolio thick with documents and several cloth-wrapped packages. "We'll need a private room," Dr. Thornton said. Prescott led them to a conference room that overlooked a courtyard garden. Calvin set the portfolio on the polished table and carefully opened it. The first document made everyone in the room catch their breath. It was a photograph clearer than the tiny one in the locket. It showed a black man in a Union naval uniform, standing proud and straight, his eyes direct and intelligent. Written on the back in fading ink, Elijah Harper, United States Navy Intelligence, 1863. "My God," Calvin whispered. "That's him. That's really him." Dr. Thornton was already examining the next document with gloved hands. "This is a commission, a secret commission signed by Calvin. This is signed by Abraham Lincoln himself." The document was brief, but its implications were staggering. "By special executive order, Elijah Harper is hereby commissioned as a lieutenant in the United States Navy Intelligence Service with all the rights and privileges thereof. Such commission to remain classified until such time as the safety of the operative and the success of the mission are assured. Mr. Harper's service to the Union and to the cause of freedom shall be remembered with the highest honor. A. Lincoln." President of the United States, Calvin had to sit down. His ancestor hadn't just been a spy. He'd been personally commissioned by Lincoln. The implications were staggering. The next several documents were intelligence reports in Elijah's hand describing Confederate operations, ship movements, plans for extending the war through guerrilla action. One report in particular caught Dr. Thornton's attention. "This is about the Sons of the Gray Dawn," she said excitedly. Elijah identified them by name in 1864. He lists their leadership, their plans, their financial backers, including, oh my. "What?" Calvin asked. "Beauregard Milner, Jace's ancestor. He wasn't just expecting those weapons, he was one of the primary organizers of the post-war resistance movement. If this information had been made public at the time, the government could have stopped them before they really got started," Hank said. "But why wasn't it?" Why keep this secret? They found the answer in a letter from Marcus Ashford to his son, dated 1878. My dear son, I place these documents in your care with the heaviest of hearts. The government has decided that revealing Elijah Harper's true role would inflame tensions during this delicate period of Reconstruction. They fear that showing how deeply Confederate resistance was planning to run would cause panic, perhaps restart the violence. So Elijah's sacrifice must remain hidden, his heroism unsung. But I cannot let his story die entirely. Keep these safe. Someday when the wounds have healed, when the truth can be told without causing harm, let the world know what Elijah Harper did for his country and his people. Political expediency, Calvin said bitterly. They buried his story for political expediency. There was more in the box. Letters from Elijah to his wife Rebecca, never sent but somehow recovered. They painted a picture of a man torn between duty and desire, between the mission he'd accepted and the family he longed to return to. My dearest Rebecca, one letter began. I write this knowing you may never read it, but I must put these words somewhere or they will consume me. Our son took his first steps yesterday, you wrote. I should be there. I should be holding his hand as he learns to walk in this world. Instead, I sit among enemies, counting their gold and planning their destruction. Is this freedom? Is this the life we dreamed of when we spoke of our children's future? I tell myself that my absence now ensures his presence in a better tomorrow. I pray this is true. I pray our sacrifice means something. Calvin found himself crying again, not caring who saw. These weren't just historical documents. They were the heart and soul of a man who'd given everything for a cause he believed in, who died knowing his story might never be told. There's something else, Dr. Thornton said, carefully unwrapping one of the cloth packages. Inside was a medal, a Navy Cross, and a certificate of award, but the name on the certificate had been officially redacted, covered with black ink. Only the date remained visible, 1865. They gave him a medal, Calvin said in wonder. They gave him one of the highest honors in the military, then classified it. Until now, Dr. Thornton said firmly. This changes everything. With these documents, we can petition to have Elijah's service officially recognized. We can get him the public honors he deserves. The final item in the box was a small leather journal, different from the one in the coffin. This one was in Marcus Ashford's hand, and it told the story of what happened after Elijah's death. April 20th, 1864. Word has come that the Magnolia Belle has been lost with all hands. The official story is that she hit a reef in a storm, but I know better. Elijah sent me a message 3 days ago saying he would act when they passed Devil's Shoal. He kept his word. The gold is lost, the weapons will never arrive, and the sons of the gray dawn are in disarray. But Elijah is gone. Rebecca weeps without knowing why her tears truly fall. She has been told her husband died in a fishing accident for her own safety and that of young Calvin. The truth is too dangerous. May 1st, 1864. Federal agents came today. They want all evidence of Elijah's mission destroyed. I have agreed to their faces but will not comply. This story must survive even if it must sleep for generations. May 15th, 1864. Rebecca Harper came to see me today with young Calvin. The boy has his father's eyes, that direct gaze that seems to see through to the truth of things. I gave Rebecca money claiming it was from a veterans fund, though no such fund exists for Negro sailors. It is the least I can do. I have promised to look after them, though I cannot tell her why I feel such obligation. The entries continued for years, chronicling Marcus Ashford's quiet support of the Harper family, his efforts to preserve Elijah's story while keeping it secret, his growing anger at a government that would honor heroes in private while denying them recognition in public. Mr. Harper, Prescott interrupted, looking uncomfortable. I'm required to inform you that there have been 3 inquiries about this box in the last hour, all claiming to represent the Ashford estate. Calvin and Hank exchanged glances. The sons of the gray dawn, Hank said. They knew about the box. How? Calvin asked. Dr. Thornton was already on her phone. Because Cornelius Ashford's letter to you wasn't the only one he sent. I'm looking at auction records now. In 1963, he sent identical letters to 12 different Harper descendants. Most were probably lost or ignored, but one was sold at an estate auction in 2019, purchased by an anonymous buyer for $3,000. Jace, Calvin said, or someone connected to him. They've known about this for years, just waiting for someone to find the coffin and lead them to the key. We need to get these documents out of here, Hank said. Now. They quickly photographed everything Dr. Thornton, insisting on proper documentation before they moved anything. Then they carefully packed the originals back into the portfolio. As they prepared to leave, Prescott cleared his throat. Mr. Harper, there's one more thing. The box rental, it's been paid through 2025, but after that, well, the Ashford Trust no longer exists. Calvin looked at the brass key in his hand, thought about the generations of men who'd kept this secret, protected this truth. I'll take over the payments. The Harper family will maintain this box. They left through a back entrance, Hank's men checking for threats. The street seemed normal tourists wandering past in the Charleston heat, but Calvin had learned not to trust appearances. They were halfway to their vehicles when Thompson spotted them. 3 cars been circling the block since we went in. Can we get to the highway? Hank asked. Not without them following. Calvin made a decision. We split up. Dr. Thornton takes the documents in one car with Thompson. Hank and I take the other with Rodriguez. We'll be the decoy. Calvin, that's not... Hank started. It's the only way. The documents are what matter. They need to get back to the university safely. Dr. Thornton clutched the portfolio tightly. What about you? We'll be fine. We're just going to lead them on a wild goose chase. Calvin tried to sound more confident than he felt. The plan worked partially. As soon as they pulled out, 2 of the 3 cars followed Calvin and Hank, while the third hesitated, clearly unsure which vehicle to pursue. By the time they decided, Dr. Thornton and Thompson were already blocks away. They're following us, Rodriguez reported from the back seat. Good, Calvin said. Let them. Hank, how do you feel about visiting my cousin Adelaide? The 93-year-old, you want to bring trouble to her door. No, but she lives in a retirement community in Mount Pleasant, gated with security. If we can get there, we'll be safe and I can finally meet family I never knew I had. Hank made a sharp turn, tires squealing. You navigate, I'll drive. The chase through Charleston's historic streets was surreal, like something from a movie Calvin would have watched with Sarah on a lazy Sunday afternoon. They couldn't go too fast, not with tourists everywhere, but their pursuers had the same limitation. There, Calvin pointed to a sign, Magnolia Gardens Retirement Community. The name felt like fate. Magnolia like the ship Elijah had died on. They pulled up to the security gate with their pursuers still 2 cars behind. The guard, seeing the vehicles racing toward his post, was already reaching for his radio. I'm here to see Adelaide Harper Simmons, Calvin said quickly. She's expecting me. I'm her cousin Calvin Harper. The guard checked his list, then looked at the cars pulling up behind them. Those folks with you? No, Hank said firmly. And they're not welcome. The guard, a former cop by the look of him, understood immediately. Go on through. Building C, apartment 312. I'll have a word with your friends. As the gate closed behind them, Calvin saw the guard approaching the other cars with 2 more security officers. Sometimes retirement communities had better security than banks. Adelaide Harper Simmons was waiting for them at her door, tiny and elegant, her white hair pinned up in a style that had probably been fashionable in the 1950s. Her eyes, though, were sharp as a hawk's, and the same brown as Calvin's own. Calvin Harper, she said, her voice stronger than he'd expected. You look just like your grandfather. Same stubborn jaw. Come in, come in. We have so much to discuss. Her apartment was a museum of family history. The walls were covered with photographs going back over a century, and Calvin found himself staring at faces that looked like his own, that shared his eyes, his nose, his smile. That's your great-aunt Josephine, Adelaide said, pointing to a stern-looking woman in a 1940s dress. And that handsome devil is your Uncle Robert, died in Korea. And this, she pulled out a leather album, this is every Harper I've been able to track down over the last 70 years. Calvin sat on her floral couch, overwhelmed. I thought I was alone. After Sarah died, after my parents were gone, I thought I was the last. Oh, child, Adelaide said, sitting beside him and taking his weathered hands in her tiny ones. There are 43 living Harpers that I know of. Scattered from here to California, but family nonetheless. And they all know about you now. What you've done bringing Elijah home, it's given us all something we'd lost. Pride. Public pride in who we are and where we come from. A knock at the door interrupted them. Hank checked through the peephole, then relaxed. It's Dr. Thornton. She entered with Thompson, the portfolio still clutched in her arms. The documents are safe. The university has already dispatched a security team to escort us back. But Mr. Harper, I had to come tell you in person. I've been on the phone with the Navy's Historical Center. They want to posthumously promote Elijah to full commander and award him the Medal of Honor. Calvin felt Adelaide's hand tighten on his. The Medal of Honor, she whispered. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Dr. Thornton quoted. His actions saved countless lives by preventing weapons from reaching Confederate resistance forces. The Navy wants to hold a full ceremony. They want to honor him properly publicly with all the recognition he should have received over a century ago. Calvin looked at the photographs covering Adelaide's walls, all these Harpers who'd lived their lives never knowing the full truth about their heritage. When 2 weeks, at Arlington National Cemetery, they want to enter him there with full military honors, if that's acceptable to the family. Calvin looked at Adelaide, who nodded with tears streaming down her face. Yes, Calvin said. Yes, that's acceptable. That's more than acceptable. That's justice. They spent the next hours in Adelaide's apartment going through family photos and records while she told stories Calvin had never heard. Stories of Harpers who'd served in every American war, who'd built businesses, raised families, contributed to their communities in ways large and small. We're survivors, Adelaide said. That's what Harpers do. We survive, we persist, and we remember, even when the world tries to make us forget. As the sun began to set, Hank's phone rang. He listened, then smiled grimly. Jace Milner just got denied bail. Seems the feds found evidence connecting him to 3 other artifact thefts and 2 cases of assault. He's going away for a long time. And the Sons of the Gray Dawn, Calvin asked. Under federal investigation. Turns out Elijah's intelligence reports from 1864 match up with some current extremist activities. The FBI is very interested in an organization that's been operating continuously since the Civil War. Calvin felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. The immediate danger had passed, but the real work was just beginning. Mr. Harper. Dr. Thornton said, I know you've been through a lot, but there's something else. The university wants to establish the Elijah Harper Center for Civil War Studies. We have the funding, we have the space, but we need someone to run it. Someone who understands not just the history, but the human element. I told you I'm not an academic. Adelaide laughed to sound like silver bells. Calvin Harper, you've just orchestrated the recovery and authentication of one of the most significant historical finds of the century. You've fought off criminals, worked with federal agents, and given interviews that have captivated the nation. I think you can handle running a research center. Calvin thought about his destroyed shack on the coast, his simple life that had been swept away by the storm, along with everything else. He thought about Sarah, what she would say if she could see him now. She'd tell you to say yes, Hank said, reading his mind. Sarah always said you were meant for bigger things than hiding from the world. Through Adelaide's window, Calvin could see the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere out there, the second chance was probably still beached where he'd left her waiting. His old life was waiting too if he wanted it back. The isolation, the simplicity, the absence of pain and complication. But he looked at Adelaide, at the photographs of all these Harpers he'd never known existed, and realized he didn't want that life anymore. The storm hadn't just brought Elijah home, it had brought Calvin home too. I'll do it, he said. I'll run the center. Adelaide clapped her hands in delight. Wonderful, and you'll stay with me until you find a place in Columbia. I have a guest room and 70 years of stories to tell you. As they prepared to leave for Columbia with the documents, Adelaide pulled Calvin aside. There's something else you should know, something not in any of the official records. She led him to her bedroom where a portrait hung that Calvin hadn't noticed before. It was old painted rather than photographed, showing a beautiful black woman in a Victorian dress. That's Rebecca, Adelaide said. Elijah's wife, your great-great-great-grandmother. After Elijah died, she never remarried, but she made sure their son Calvin grew up knowing his father was a hero, even if she couldn't say how. She started a school for black children, taught them to read and write when it was still dangerous to do so. She said education was the weapon her husband would have wanted them to have. Calvin stared at the portrait, at the strength and sorrow in Rebecca's eyes. She knew, didn't she? She knew what really happened to him. I think she did. Women always know more than they're supposed to. She just kept that knowledge safe, like we've kept all our stories safe, waiting for the right time to tell them. A car horn honked outside. The university security team had arrived to escort them back to Columbia. Calvin took one last look at the portrait, at all the photographs at this testament to family he'd never known existed. Thank you, he told Adelaide, for keeping all of this, for preserving it. That's what family does, she said simply. We remember, we preserve, and when the time comes, we make sure the truth is told. As they drove away from the retirement community, Calvin saw that the cars that had followed them were gone, towed away, or their occupants arrested. The threat had passed, at least for now, but Calvin knew there would always be those who preferred the comfortable lies of history to its uncomfortable truths. You know, Hank said, as they headed north toward Columbia, this isn't the ending I expected when you called me for help. What did you expect? I figured we'd secure the gold, you'd sell it, maybe buy a better boat and go back to fishing. I didn't expect you to become some kind of historical celebrity academic. Calvin laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in years. Neither did I. But maybe that's what storms do. They don't just destroy. They also clear away the old to make room for something new. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Thornton, who was in the car ahead of them. CNN wants an exclusive interview. 60 Minutes is calling. The Smithsonian wants to display the coffin. Your life is about to get very complicated. Calvin thought about complicated. He thought about simple. He thought about Elijah Harper choosing the complicated path because it was right, because it mattered, because sometimes one person standing up to history could change its course. Let it be complicated, Mom, he said aloud. What? Hank asked. Nothing. Just thinking that maybe complicated isn't always bad. Maybe sometimes it's necessary. As Columbia's lights appeared in the distance, Calvin felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Purpose. Connection. The sense that he was part of something larger than his own grief. The storm had taken everything from him, his home, his solitude, his simple life, but it had given him so much more. It had given him family purpose, and most importantly, it had given him a reason to rejoin the world. Elijah Harper's coffin was safe at the university, waiting to give up more of its secrets. The documents were authenticated and secure. The truth was finally being told. And in 2 weeks, Elijah would finally receive the honors he'd been denied for over a century. Calvin pulled out the brass key, holding it up to the dashboard light. Such a small thing to have unlocked so much history. He thought about keeping it, but then had a better idea. Adelaide should have this, he said. She's been the keeper of the family history for 70 years. The key belongs with her. We can stop by on the way to Arlington, Hank suggested. I have a feeling she'll want to be there when Elijah is buried. We'll all be there, Calvin said. Every Harper who can make it. We're going to stand together and watch our ancestor receive the honors he earned. The highway stretched ahead, carrying them toward a future Calvin couldn't have imagined when he'd awakened to check storm damage just days ago. Behind them, the Charleston evening was soft and warm, holding its secrets close. But one secret at least was free now, riding with them toward Columbia, and then to the wider world. Elijah Harper was coming home, not to the isolated coastline where his coffin had washed ashore, but to the history books, to the national memory, to his rightful place among America's heroes. And Calvin Harper, who'd wanted nothing more than to be forgotten, was going to make sure the world remembered. The 2 weeks leading up to Arlington passed in a blur of activity that would have exhausted a younger man, but Calvin found himself energized by purpose. The university had given him temporary quarters on campus, a small apartment usually reserved for visiting professors, and he'd wake each morning to find his phone filled with messages from Harpers across the country who'd heard the news. Calvin, this is your cousin Michael from Detroit, one voicemail said. My grandmother always told us we had a hero in the family tree. Now we know she was right. I'll be at Arlington with my whole family. Another from Texas. Mr. Harper, you don't know me, but my maiden name was Harper. My grandfather was your grandfather's cousin. We're flying in from Houston. Thank you for bringing our family's honor to light. Each message was a thread in a tapestry Calvin was only beginning to see the full pattern of. The Harper family wasn't just larger than he'd known. It was accomplished, diverse, spread across every corner of American life. There were teachers and soldiers, doctors, and fishermen, musicians and engineers, all connected by blood and now by pride in their shared heritage. Dr. Thornton had become his constant companion through the preparations, helping him navigate the media attention while ensuring Elijah's story was told accurately. They'd spent hours going through the journal, uncovering details that made the historical portrait even richer. Listen to this, she said one afternoon, reading from a water-stained page. Elijah writes, the captain spoke today of the world they hope to build after the war, where men like me would know our place. He does not know that men like me have already found our place. It is standing for freedom even when freedom seems impossible. I will sink this ship and their dreams with it. And if I die in the doing, I die a free man, having chosen my own fate rather than accepting theirs. Calvin felt the now familiar tightness in his throat. Every page revealed more of Elijah's character, his intelligence, his determination. The man had been extraordinary, and the world had almost lost his story entirely. The Navy had sent a liaison commander, Patricia Wells, a sharp-eyed woman who treated the preparations with the gravity they deserved. Mr. Harper, she said during one of their meetings, the Secretary of the Navy will be attending the ceremony personally. This isn't just about honoring your ancestor. It's about acknowledging a failure in how we've recorded history and committing to do better. The medal ceremony was scheduled for the morning of September 18th, a Thursday, that promised clear skies and mild temperatures. Calvin stood in his temporary apartment that morning, adjusting the tie Adelaide had insisted on buying him. He hadn't worn a suit since Sarah's funeral, and the man looking back from the mirror seemed like a stranger. You clean up pretty good for an old fisherman, Hank said from the doorway. He was in his dress uniform, medals from Afghanistan, catching the morning light. I don't feel like me, Calvin admitted. You're not the same you. The storm changed that. Sometimes we got to let go of who we were to become who we're supposed to be. The drive to Arlington was surreal. Their convoy included university vehicles, Navy staff cars, and a hearse carrying Elijah's remains, which had been transferred to a proper casket bearing the American flag. Calvin rode with Adelaide, who, despite her age, had insisted on making the journey. I wouldn't miss this for the world, she said, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with the Harper family crest she'd researched years ago. Do you know how many times I've driven past Arlington, wondering if any of our family was buried there? Now Elijah will be with full honors. As they approached the cemetery, Calvin saw the crowds. Hundreds of people lined the route, some holding American flags, others with signs reading, Honor Elijah Harper and Truth Matters. The media was there in force but kept at a respectful distance by military police. The ceremony site was Section 60, where recent heroes from Iraq and Afghanistan were buried. Calvin thought Elijah would have appreciated that, being laid to rest among other warriors who'd sacrificed for their country regardless of the century they'd served in. The Harper family had been given a reserved section, and Calvin was stunned by the turnout. Over 100 people ranging from Adelaide's age to infants in their parents' arms. Some he recognized from photographs Adelaide had shown him. Others were strangers who shared his eyes, his jawline, the subtle family resemblances that connected them all. A young woman approached him, maybe 30, with twin boys holding her hands. Mr. Harper, I'm Denise Harper Williams. These are my sons, Elijah and Calvin. I named them last week after I heard what you'd done. I want them to grow up knowing they're named for heroes. Calvin knelt down to the boys' level, seeing in their bright eyes the future of the Harper line. Your ancestor was the bravest man I never met, he told them, and you carry his name forward. That's a responsibility and an honor. The ceremony began with a Navy band playing taps, the mournful notes carrying across the cemetery. The Secretary of the Navy, a stern man named Richardson, spoke first. We gather today to correct a historical injustice. He began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Lieutenant Commander Elijah Harper gave his life in service to his country, to the cause of freedom. and to the principle that all men are created equal. For over a century and a half, his sacrifice was hidden, his heroism classified, his story untold. Today we tell that story. Today we give him the honors he always deserved. The medal ceremony was next. Calvin was called forward to accept the Medal of Honor on Elijah's behalf. As the secretary read the citation, Calvin felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as an intelligence operative aboard the Confederate vessel Magnolia Belle. Lieutenant Commander Harper, though surrounded by enemies and with no hope of rescue, deliberately sank the ship to prevent weapons and gold from reaching Confederate resistance forces. His actions saved countless lives and shortened the conflict. His sacrifice represents the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The medal was heavy in Calvin's hands, its blue ribbon bright against the gold star. He thought of Elijah alone in those final moments, as the ship went down knowing he would die, but that his death would mean something. Dr. Thornton spoke next, providing historical context that had the audience leaning forward in their seats. She told of the sons of the gray dawn of the planned guerrilla war that would have extended the conflict for years, of the weapons that never arrived, because one man had the courage to stop them. Elijah Harper's story forces us to reconsider what we think we know about the Civil War, she said. How many other heroes have been erased from our history? How many other stories of courage and sacrifice have been buried because they didn't fit someone's narrative? Today we commit to finding those stories, to telling them, to ensuring that history reflects all of its heroes, not just the ones someone decided were acceptable. Then it was Calvin's turn to speak. He approached the podium with legs that felt like water, looking out at the sea of faces, cameras, and flags. In the front row sat Adelaide, tears streaming down her face, but her head held high. Behind her, the Harper family stood together, united for the first time in generations. Calvin pulled out the speech he'd written, then folded it and put it back in his pocket. This moment called for something more than prepared words. My name is Calvin Harper. He began, his voice stronger than he'd expected. 5 years ago, I lost my wife, Sarah, to cancer. In my grief, I retreated from the world, became a hermit living on the Carolina coast, wanting nothing more than to be left alone with my sorrow. I thought my story was over. He paused, seeing nods of understanding from some of the older faces in the crowd. Then a storm came. Not just any storm, but one that seemed sent by Providence itself. It brought me Elijah Harper's coffin, washed it right up to my dock, like the ocean was hand-delivering my heritage. At first I thought it was about the gold, about treasure. But I was wrong. It was about something far more valuable. It was about truth. It was about family. It was about understanding that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. Calvin looked at the casket draped in the flag Elijah had died serving, though that service had been secret and unacknowledged. Elijah Harper was born free in 1825, a rarity for a black man in North Carolina at that time. He could have lived a quiet life, stayed safe, avoided the conflict that was tearing the nation apart. But he chose differently. He chose to use his freedom to fight for others' freedom. He chose to risk everything because he believed in an America that didn't yet exist, one where all men truly were created equal. The crowd was silent now, even the children sensing the gravity of the moment. He infiltrated Confederate operations, gained their trust, all while sending intelligence to the Union. And when he learned of a shipment that would prolong the war, that would fund continued violence and oppression, he made the ultimate sacrifice. He sank the ship he was on, knowing it meant his own death, because he valued others' lives more than his own. Calvin's voice broke slightly, but he continued. For over a century, his story was hidden, classified, deemed too dangerous to tell. His widow Rebecca never knew the truth of how he died. His son. My great-great-grandfather grew up believing his father had died in a simple fishing accident. Generations of Harpers lived without knowing we had a hero in our bloodline. He looked at the Harper family section, seeing his own emotions reflected in their faces. But truth has a way of surfacing like that coffin in the storm. It may take time, it may take generations, but truth will not stay buried forever. Today we're not just burying Elijah Harper with the honors he deserves. We're resurrecting his story. We're ensuring that every American child, regardless of color, knows that heroes come from all backgrounds, all races, all circumstances. Calvin held up the Medal of Honor. This medal belongs to Elijah, but his legacy belongs to all of us. It challenges us to be brave when bravery seems impossible. It calls us to sacrifice for others when selfishness would be easier. It demands that we tell the truth even when lies are more comfortable. He paused, thinking of his own journey from that storm-lashed night to this moment. That storm didn't just bring me Elijah's coffin. It brought me back to life. It showed me that hiding from the world, from connection, from purpose, isn't living. It's just existing. Elijah Harper died so others could live free. The least we can do is actually live fully and with purpose. The burial ceremony was performed with full military honors. The honor guard moved with precision, folding the flag that had draped the casket into a perfect triangle. The Navy band played Eternal Father, the Navy hymn, as the casket was lowered into the ground. A 21-gun salute cracked across the cemetery, each shot echoing like history itself, acknowledging what had been hidden. The Secretary of the Navy presented the folded flag to Calvin. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he said, the traditional words carrying extra weight given how long that gratitude had been delayed. As the formal ceremony concluded, something unexpected happened. One of the Harper children, a girl of maybe 10, started singing Amazing Grace. Her voice was pure and clear, and soon others joined in. By the second verse, the entire Harper family was singing, their voices joining in harmony, born not of practice but of shared heritage and emotion. Calvin found himself singing two words he hadn't voiced since Sarah's funeral. But this time, they weren't weighted with despair, but with hope. Elijah Harper had been lost, but now was found, had been forgotten, but now was remembered. After the ceremony, the family gathered at a reception hall in Arlington. Calvin moved through the crowd. Meeting cousins he'd never known, existed, hearing stories of Harpers who'd served, struggled, succeeded, and survived through American history. "You know what strikes me most?" Adelaide said, finding him during a quiet moment. "How many of us became teachers? It's like Rebecca's spirit lived on her belief that education was the ultimate weapon against oppression." Calvin nodded, thinking of the education center that would bear Elijah's name. "Maybe that's how we honor them best, not just by remembering their stories, but by ensuring others learn from them." Dr. Thornton approached with a tablet in her hand. "Calvin, you need to see this. The story has gone viral. The hashtag Elijah Harper Hero is trending nationally. Schools are already asking for materials to teach about him. The Smithsonian wants to create a permanent exhibit." But Calvin's attention was drawn to something else on the screen, a comment from someone named Marcus Beauregard in South Carolina. "My family has documents too. Other side of the story. The truth about the sons of the Gray Dawn. Contact me." Calvin and Dr. Thornton exchanged glances. Even now, even after everything, there were more secrets waiting to surface. "Tomorrow," Calvin said. "Today is for Elijah and for family." As the reception continued, Calvin stepped outside for air. The September evening was mild, and Arlington stretched out before him, thousands of white headstones marking thousands of sacrifices. Somewhere among them lay soldiers from every American conflict, each with their own story of service and loss. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the Coast Guard. They'd recovered the Second Chance's boat and had her in dry dock for repairs. Did he want her back? Calvin thought about it. That boat represented his old life, his exile, his attempt to hide from the world. But it also represented survival resilience, the ability to weather storms, just like the Harpers themselves. "Yes," he texted back. "I want her back, but she'll need a new home port, Columbia, South Carolina." He could use the boat to take students out on the water to teach them about the coastal history. Elijah had known the waterways that had been escape routes for some and prison walls for others. The Second Chance would get a second chance just as he had. Hank found him there, standing in the gathering dusk. "Hell of a day, brother." "It's not over," Calvin said, showing him the message about the Sons of the Gray Dawn documents. Hank's expression hardened. "You think it's a threat?" "No. I think it's someone else who's tired of secrets. Someone else who wants the truth told, even if it's an uncomfortable truth for their family." They stood in comfortable silence, two veterans who'd seen enough of war to appreciate peace, enough of loss to value what remained. "Sarah would have loved this," Calvin said finally. She always said I came from good people. She would have loved knowing how good. She knows, Hank said simply. Wherever she is, she knows. As they walked back to the reception, Calvin's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Harper, this is Jennifer Walsh from Random House Publishing. We'd like to talk to you about writing a book about Elijah Harper and your discovery. This is a story that needs to be told in full. Calvin almost said no reflexively, the hermit in him recoiling from more exposure. But then he thought about all the young Harpers he'd met today, the ones who would grow up knowing their heritage. They deserved the full story, not just news clips and sound bites. Send me a proposal, he heard himself saying. I'll consider it. The reception was winding down when Adelaide pulled Calvin aside one more time. I have something for you, she said, pressing a small object into his hand. It was a pocket watch, old and worn, but still ticking. This was my grandfather's. He always claimed it had belonged to Elijah's son, Calvin I. I can't prove it, but I want you to have it. You're the one who brought our family together. You're the one who made sure Elijah's time finally came. Calvin held the watch, feeling its steady pulse against his palm. Time, which had seemed to stop when Sarah died, was moving again. The past was being recovered, the present was being lived, and the future for the first time in years seemed worth facing. As the Harper family prepared to disperse back to their various homes, they made plans to meet again. Not in another century, not when another crisis brought them together, but regularly, intentionally, as family should. Next year, Calvin announced, surprising himself, the anniversary of Elijah's burial. We'll meet at the Education Center in Columbia. All Harpers welcome. We'll tell stories, share our history, make sure the connections we've made today don't fade. The agreement was unanimous, sealed with embraces and exchanged phone numbers with promises to stay in touch, and stories yet to be shared. That night, Calvin stayed in a hotel near Arlington, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. He stood at his window looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C., thinking about how Elijah had once looked at these same stars planning his dangerous mission, knowing what it might cost. Tomorrow he would return to Columbia to the work of building the Education Center, to the task of ensuring Elijah's story was properly told. There would be more documents to examine, more secrets to uncover, more truth to bring to light. The message from Marcus Beauregard suggested that the Sons of the Grey Dawn's version of events might complicate the narrative, but Calvin wasn't afraid of complexity anymore. Truth was rarely simple. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos from today. The Harper family gathered around Elijah's grave, the Medal of Honor gleaming in the sun, Adelaide's proud tears, the children who would carry the Harper name forward. Then he found an older photo, one of Sarah, from their last anniversary before the diagnosis. She was laughing at something he'd said, her eyes bright with life and love. For the first time since her death, looking at her picture didn't just bring pain, it brought gratitude too. Thank you, he whispered to her image. Thank you for believing I was worth something, even when I didn't believe it myself. Thank you for pushing me to be better. Thank you for loving a stubborn fisherman who didn't know his own story. A text arrived from Dr. Thornton. The university is already receiving inquiries about the Education Center. 3 major foundations want to provide funding. Elijah's story is inspiring people to look into their own family histories to uncover their own hidden heroes. You've started something, Calvin. Calvin smiled, thinking of the ripples spreading out from one storm, one discovery, one decision to fight for truth rather than let it remain buried. Elijah had thrown a stone into the waters of history by sinking that ship, and the ripples were still spreading 160 years later. He opened his laptop and began to write not the book proposal or an academic paper, but a letter to Elijah. It was something Sarah had done when her father died, writing him letters she would never send, telling him about the life he was missing. Calvin had thought it silly at the time, but now he understood the need to communicate with the dead to bridge the gap between past and present. Dear Elijah, he wrote, today we buried you with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The Navy called you a hero. Your family, over 100 strong, sang Amazing Grace over your grave. The nation knows your name and your sacrifice. You are no longer forgotten. He wrote about the family Elijah had never met, the generations that had followed the struggles and triumphs that had marked the Harper line. He wrote about Rebecca's school, about the teachers and soldiers, and workers who had carried the Harper name forward. He wrote about his own journey from grief to purpose, from isolation to connection. Your sacrifice mattered, Calvin concluded. The weapons never arrived. The war ended sooner because of what you did. And now, over a century later, your story will inspire others to be brave, to stand for truth, to sacrifice for justice. You died alone on that ship, but you are alone no longer. You are surrounded by family, by honor, by the gratitude of a nation that finally knows your name. Rest well, ancestor. Your mission is complete. Calvin saved the letter, knowing he would add to it over time, documenting the ongoing impact of Elijah's story. Tomorrow he would return to Columbia to the work of building something lasting from this discovery. But tonight, he simply sat with the knowledge that he had fulfilled a duty he hadn't even known he carried, the duty of a descendant to ensure their ancestors' story survived. Outside Washington, D.C. hummed with life, with politics and power, with all the complexities of a nation still struggling with its history. But in Arlington, Elijah Harper rested peacefully, at last, his truth told, his sacrifice honored, his place in history secured. Calvin closed his laptop and prepared for bed, setting Adelaide's pocket watch on the nightstand where he could hear its steady ticking. Time moved forward as it always had, but now it carried Elijah's story with it, no longer buried in the past, but alive in the present and reaching toward the future. The storm that had brought the coffin to Calvin's dock had passed, but its effects would be felt for generations. Truth once revealed could not be hidden again. Heroes once recognized would not be forgotten. And families once reunited would not easily be separated. As sleep finally took him, Calvin's last thought was of that morning on the beach, pulling the metal coffin from the waves, having no idea how it would change everything. Sometimes the greatest treasures weren't gold or jewelry, but truth itself, waiting patiently for someone with the courage to bring it to light. The second chance had lived up to her name, not just for Calvin, but for Elijah, for the Harper family, and for a piece of American history that had almost been lost forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new work to be done. But tonight, Calvin Harper slept peacefully, knowing he had done right by his ancestor, his family, and himself. The storm had brought him Elijah, but Elijah had brought him back to life. And for that, Calvin would be forever grateful.